Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on the final day of 2024. Donald Trump's inauguration is now less than 1 month away. As the beginning of Trump's second administration looms, many are worried, with considerable justification, about the foreign policies that Trump is likely to pursue. This is a particularly pressing question for the nations of the Western Hemisphere, where the U.S. government has been in a dominant position for a very long time. There are more and more signs that Donald Trump will aggressively pursue his version of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is a United States foreign policy position that opposes European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. It holds that any intervention in the political affairs of the Americas by foreign powers is a potentially hostile act against the United States itself. The doctrine was central to American grand strategy in the 20th century and was first articulated by U.S. President James Monroe in 1823. At that time, of course, the U.S. government was concerned principally with interference by Western European powers, primarily Britain, France, and Spain, in the Western Hemisphere. Now, of course, its primary concern lies with China and Russia. Recent statements by Trump suggest that he espouses a particularly muscular version of the Monroe Doctrine. For example, on Christmas Day, Trump wished Merry Christmas to all, including, quote, to the wonderful soldiers of China who are lovingly but illegally operating the Panama Canal, close quote. He mocked Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and claimed the U.S. could annex Canada as its 51st state. And for good measure, he addressed, quote, the people of Greenland, which is needed by the United States for national security purposes and who want the U.S. to be there, and we will, exclamation mark. So if that isn't a muscular version of the Monroe Doctrine, I don't know what is. Now, in light of such provocative statements, what can the Western Hemisphere expect from Trump 2.0? Now here to discuss this with me is José Luis Granados Ceja. José Luis is a journalist and political analyst based in Mexico City. He is a staff writer with Venezuela Analysis, covering regional and international issues, and is a co-host of the Soberania podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on the Reason to Resist for the first time, José Luis.
Very happy to be here and happy to talk about this really important topic.
So I'd like to begin, José Luis, with Trump's recent threat to impose steep tariffs on Canada and Mexico. In late November, the U.S. president-elect threatened to slap a 25% tariff, which would devastate the economies of Canada and Mexico, on all products entering the country from those two countries on January 25, his inauguration day, unless those countries curb the flow of drugs and migrants across their borders. 3 days after Trump made that threat, Justin Trudeau responded by rushing off to Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate in Palm Beach, Florida, shortly after returning to Canada from a dinner in Palm Beach with the new president. Trudeau announced the formation of a $1.3 billion joint strike force, that's what he called it, to survey the enormous Canada-U.S. border on a 24/7 basis. Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, took a rather different approach to responding to Trump's threat. José Luis, could you explain to us how she responded to this particular 25% tariff threat? And what do you think her response tells us about how she's likely to deal with the Trump administration going forward?
Yeah, so here in Mexico, we recently saw the election of Claudia Sheinbaum over the summer. She comes from the National Regeneration Movement Party, Morena, which is the party founded by López Obrador, who won in 2018. And that's marked a very important shift in Mexican politics. So I always like to start there. We always call it a watershed moment here in Mexico. The election of López Obrador, I think, in a lot of ways represented the end of the neoliberal era. It's hard to define exactly what this new era is. It's a very kind of nationalist, development-driven kind of political policy here domestically. And Claudia Sheinbaum represents a continuation of that. What we've also seen, of course, is a shift in the foreign policy of Mexico, whereas before we saw a foreign policy that was largely one that was very tolerant and enabling of U.S. foreign policy throughout the region and the world. I always highlight the fact that under Peña Nieto, the president before López Obrador, Mexico was a major player in the Lima Group. Being part of the Lima Group tells you everything you need to know about the foreign policy of a country. But that ended. That ended with López Obrador, and that shift continues under Claudia Sheinbaum, comes from the same party, and very much represents a continuation, if not a deepening, of what's called here domestically the fourth transformation. Now, in terms of the relationship with the United States and Canada, we see this very, really important difference in terms of the response from the respective leaders. And I think in a lot of ways, what Claudia did is proving anyway to have been the correct path. What she did was write a letter outlining the long history of cooperation, of working together between Mexico and the United States around the issue of drugs and migration. This has been a major issue in the bilateral relationship for a very long time, but certainly more recently, a very pressing issue, especially for policymakers, both Democratic and Republican. And that letter was diplomatic, but it was also very forceful. I mean, she did not mince words. And I think the key thing that to take away from that letter is the fact that she said that she was going to stand up to Trump, that she wasn't going to take his bullying tactics and say, if you apply tariffs to us, there will be retaliatory tariffs. And of course, we all know where that ends. You know, I'm not an economist, but I think if you take a look at what the discussion has been regarding this threat to impose 25% tariffs, as you said in your introduction, it would represent a total destruction of the economic relationship between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, but would be bad news for all three countries and their economies. This would be devastating. We can critique the free trade agreement. As we know, NAFTA really remade the economies for all three countries. But it was approved in the 90s. That has led to a development of the economy, certainly here in Mexico, on a very specific terms. And to change that radically like that would obviously be very negative. And she said so much as in her letter, saying, if you do this, you're going to destroy our economy here. And it looks like he largely backed off. It seems that Trump, far from being offended by a woman telling him why he's wrong, actually, in a way, I would argue, is a begrudging respect of saying, okay, all right, I'm working with somebody who's serious. And in fact, in one of the interviews, they asked him what he thought about Claudia Sheinbaum. And he said, well, I'm not really that familiar, but I understand that she's close to Lopez Obrador, and I got along famously with him, so I think we'll be okay. So at least on that kind of interpersonal level, things seem to be pretty smooth, which is obviously important as well. But I think when you contrast it, particularly in the case of Justin Trudeau and Canada, you see that the responses could not be more different, and how bad things have gone for Trudeau. I mean, he's losing members of his cabinet. He's being totally destroyed in the press around his strategy, criticizing his decision to fly down there, to treat it with this urgency. I think really in that regard, you can see that the difference in the response has led to a worse outcome for Canada and for Canadians. I think Trudeau finds himself in a very precarious position. And ultimately, I'll close with this, it boils down to that. I mean, if you had to try to understand why the different reactions from each country, in the case of Mexico, we have an extraordinarily popular president who is widely supported by the population and actually conducts her foreign policy cognizant of that, knowing that if push comes to shove, she has the support of the population behind her. We had a test similarly in Lopez Obrador's term where there was this kind of bellicose language, talking about invasion, talking about these kind of really harsh foreign policy gestures from the United States towards Mexico. And he said, well, you want to see what we think here in Mexico? Calls a demonstration, and 500,000 people turned out to reject interventionism in Mexico. So I think similarly, if it came to that, Claudia Sheinbaum can count on the support of the population that allows her to have this better bargaining position. And of course, we know Justin Trudeau is famously unpopular, likely to lose the next election when it does happen. And that makes it much more difficult for him to be able to negotiate with somebody like Trump, who is famous for being able to negotiate quite astutely, even when it comes to issues like this with his bluster and his threats. As for what he'll actually do, well, I think we really do need to wait and see what Trump does. But this definitely is a very worrisome signal here from the start.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, José Luis, but there was a lot of drama at the provincial level as a response to Trump's threat in Canada. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, who's a conservative, very much right-leaning, took the lead in vowing retaliation. He was even talking about shutting off the flow of energy, principally oil from the tar sands, if the United States imposed these tariffs. And all of that went awry. He was actually going around U.S. media making this threat. But all of that went awry when the Premier of Alberta, which is the province that has the most oil by far, and much more than Ford's Ontario, threw cold water on that whole idea and expressed no interest in withholding energy exports to the United States. But what was interesting about it was, Trudeau and Ford, they tend to have had a very cordial relationship. It's hard not to avoid the impression that that behind the scenes, Trudeau kind of delegated Doug Ford to be the bad cop. But he himself certainly wasn't willing to do that. He was not willing to stand up to Trump. And as you've indicated, he probably has only a few months left in his tenure as Canada's prime minister. I wanted to talk to you some more about President Sheinbaum, because I understand she comes from a very solid left-wing background. Her parents, I've read, were communists and were very active in the labor movement, social justice movements. Where would you say her politics lie on the political spectrum relative to her predecessor, López Obrador? Would you say she's pretty much aligned with him politically, that she's more to the left, more to the center? What's your sense of her politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad we get to talk about this, because I think in a lot of ways, what's happening in Mexico and the election of Claudia Sheinbaum speaks to the fact that people should pay attention to what's happening here. One of the most tricky situations that all of the progressive and leftist governments in Latin America found themselves in was the succession, right? And some less successful than others. I always highlight the case of Ecuador, right, where the succession from Correa to Lenin Moreno led to the treason of Lenin Moreno, the destruction of their movement, one that they still haven't quite recovered from, right? They haven't been able to win back the presidency. I mean, that's the worst case scenario, right? We have the tensions between Lucho Arce and Evo Morales in Bolivia. Venezuela is a different case. Obviously, we know that Chavez passed and Maduro was able to rise to the occasion, but obviously, there was a difficult moment there. I think U.S. imperialism really turned the screws on Venezuela because they sensed a certain weakness because of the absence of Chavez. But here in Mexico, the transition could not have gone more smoothly. And I'm really happy to be able to talk about this because, there was a succession process here in Mexico. And the way that the Morena party does is that they hold public polls. And whoever does best in those polls ends up being the candidate. And there was a number of different candidates who present themselves. The former Interior Minister, the former Foreign Secretary, and Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the former governor of Mexico City. They were the three leading candidates. There were others, but those were mainly the key ones there. So Adán Augusto, the former Interior Minister, he was very kind of the center of the road, keep things as they are. Even his campaign slogans were like, more Lopez, because they share a last name. And then there was Marcelo Ebrard, the former foreign minister, and he very much represented a shift to the center, right? But Claudia Sheinbaum was the kind of deepening slightly to the left of López Obrador option. The reason I say that is because, like you said, so she's got a very interesting background. She's a red diaper baby. Yes, she comes from leftist communist parents, but was very active from a very young age. Some of her biographies talk about how when she was 12 years old, she would go to the infamous prison here, Lecumberri, to visit some of the political prisoners and read books to them and interact with them. She became active in the student movement when she was in high school and university and its equivalent. She explicitly worked on a political organization that tried to bridge the link between the countryside, the campesinos, and the working class in the cities. And then she became an academic. So she went and got her doctorate and was an academic for a while, but became back to politics in an active way under López Obrador when he was mayor, governor of Mexico City. And there she did an extraordinary job, eventually becomes mayor of Mexico City in the 2018 election that saw López Obrador elected. And like I said, she very much kind of represented that progressive vision, that deepening of the fourth transformation. López Obrador himself said, be careful when I leave office. Some of my adversaries are very eager to see me leave, but I am bougie, to translate the term. The term he used in Spanish is fresa. I'm bougie compared to Claudia Sheinbaum. And she's shown to have not only maintained the important political decisions of López Obrador, the cash transfers, the new foreign policy, the reorganization of the state, all of this, but also betting on a more progressive leftist vision. And I think what we've seen from her thus far has been one, and the advantage of that is that, López Obrador brought in a very important social program, the cash transfers to seniors, universal pension for seniors. And she gets to inherit that and actually build on it. So one of the first things she did was to go and do a census of everybody who is receiving that constitutional right, that pension, and to do a survey in terms of their health needs in order to bring doctors directly to them, people who've never seen a doctor before. And so you can see how she has a more social vision. She always uses a discourse around rights, as opposed to, where we hear in a lot of, the United States and Canada, they'll talk about entitlements or social programs and things like that, right? But she talks about constitutional rights and has pushed for the party to put these things into the Constitution so that nobody can come in later and take them away. And that shows that it's a different kind of vision. It's not one where, the goodwill of the government because it believes in this. No, it understands that these are your rights and you have the right to go and claim them. And I think that kind of speaks to the vision that she has. And she's also had a bit of a bigger foreign presence. López Obrador famously didn't like to travel. Claudia Sheinbaum, one of her early actions is to go to the G20, where she goes and meets with world leaders, up and including, Xi Jinping from China, right? Making the effort to show that Mexico is not going to play this game of that we saw previously, that I alluded to earlier, of just kind of following whatever the U.S. foreign policy institutions want from Mexico, actually forging an independent path. And I'm very encouraged thus far. And also importantly, right, López Obrador is kind of a unique political phenomenon. He was incredibly good at establishing a connection with the population. He said that he visited every municipality in the country at least twice. Well, Claudia Sheinbaum doesn't have that same exact style, but she's learned really, really well. She's actually adapted really well. She's much better in public, speaking before a large crowd, and I think has done a good job of adapting to the role, and a lot of ways kind of inheriting that goodwill that people had toward López Obrador. And that she's actually doing better now than he ever did in terms of popularity amongst the population.
Yeah, and I understand she won in what could fairly be described as a landslide. Is that right? Right.
Huge. She beat the nearest rival by 30 points, almost 60% of the vote. In Mexico's democratic history, no one has received a mandate. It was bigger than López Obrador's mandate, which was extraordinary at the time. So much so that actually Morena and its allies in the Congress won a supermajority in Congress. So they don't even have to negotiate with the opposition, which is famously intransigent, in order to push these constitutional reforms. That's one of the things that we've really been encouraged by. You win a mandate, and you have to act on it to actually convey that message to your followers that electing us isn't more of the same. We're actually going to follow through. And they've been really consistent about pushing as far as they possibly can go with this supermajority of benefiting from the fact that they don't need to negotiate anything with these right-wing opposition parties and actually doing what they said they would do. And there's a whole series of them. But just to give you an example of things that I think will find of interest to your Canadian viewers and listeners, because I know that Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous rights are very important amongst the progressive and the left in Canada. Here in Mexico, one of the major constitutional reforms actually conveys to Indigenous communities, so not just individuals, but Indigenous communities, status before the law. So there's now they're called sujetos de derecho, which means basically they allow them to have more options to pursue their Indigenous governance models, control over their territories, decide what kind of activities happen, including extractive activities, but also to be able to go before the courts as a population, as a peoples, and say, our community says we don't want this, and actually backed by the state. So it's a total, if you actually really kind of think about the implications of that, a reimagining of the relationship with Indigenous peoples in Mexico, which obviously is a major issue here, given the long history of marginalization, of exclusion, of racism. I think that one in particular is the one that I always like to highlight in terms of just where the country is headed. We're really talking about a whole new imagination of what the relationship with Indigenous peoples can be, about the role of the working class, of the campesinos. Mexico was for the longest time viewed as a place for cheap resources and cheap labor. And starting with López Obrador and continued with Claudia Sheinbaum, we're seeing that change.
So you mentioned the case of China and Mexico's relations with China. It's my understanding that Mexico, under López Obrador, also pursued an independent foreign policy with respect to Russia and the Ukraine war. Absolutely. What, in a nutshell, was his policy towards that war and Russia, and what do you think Sheinbaum's is likely to be?
So Mexico tries to always promote a peaceful resolution to conflicts. That is the official position of the Mexican state. That actually transcends governments. Obviously, during the neoliberal era, that was not respected. We saw lots of intervention and cozying up to U.S. imperialism, but and in Mexico, in the case of the Ukraine conflict, there was a push for Mexico to join in on the sanctions and the isolation of Russia and to break relations and all that. Mexico didn't fall for any of that, did not play that game, refused to, and there was strong diplomatic pressure to do it. López Obrador was against Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, but more so because of Mexico's history of a larger neighbor interfering and invading Mexico, and so taking a position in terms of viewing it as an invasion, and I know that's controversial, and rejecting on those grounds, but not necessarily playing into this game of trying to treat it as a proxy war and taking sides in this. So in that regard, and of course, keeping positive relationships with Russia. And then we've seen a growth of the U.S.-Russia relationship since López Obrador and now with Claudia Sheinbaum. In terms of China, and I think this is the key one.
Sorry to interrupt. You said U.S. Russia. I think you meant Mexico Russia.
Sorry, yes, Mexico Russia, an extension of Mexico Russia relationship, a blossoming of that relationship, and similarly with China. And I wanted to speak a little bit more on China, because I think that's the one to pay attention to when it comes to Mexico, because I think this whole noise around the tariffs, all of this kind of talking about Mexico is a backdoor to China and its goods and all this kind of stuff. First of all, it's not true at all, right? Anybody who says that is not being serious. In fact, Chrystia Freeland was asked directly, you talk about Mexico being a backdoor. Well, what proof do you have? And of course, she kind of, equivocated a little and couldn't really deliver an answer, couldn't point to anything. And in fact, they talk about auto parts and auto manufacturing in Mexico of Chinese brands like BYD. There is a BYD plant in North America, but it's in the United States. It's not in Mexico. And so I think all of this noise around the tariffs and Mexico being a backdoor is actually much more about, I think, an effort by policymakers, by politicians in the United States and Canada to try to convince Mexico to join this kind of rival bloc, to position itself against China, against BRICS, against the global South, against Russia, all of this. They want to kind of treat North America as a union, as a kind of a single unit, but that's not going to fly. Mexico has its relationship with the United States, with Canada. It obviously is part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. DEMEC, it's called here. CUMSA, I think it's called in Canada. And it's going to continue. That is the policy position of the Mexican government, to continue to benefit from that economic relationship, but not to the exclusion of others, right? Mexico has an interest in diversifying where it exports to. There's been a massive investment in public infrastructure, like the Interoceanic Corridor, which goes through the skinniest part of Mexico. They're investing billions into the Manzanillo port in order to better facilitate exports to, the Asia Pacific region. And that's not going to change, right? And there's going to continue to be this effort to have friendly, cordial, positive economic, political relations with China. So this idea that Mexico should somehow join this other bloc is a non-starter here. And so if you look at those, you can understand how it does have an independent foreign policy. Under López Obrador, we also saw the rescue of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, sort of the alternative to the Organization of American States, which, we don't have time to get into it, but we all know its long history of imperialism and intervention here in Latin America. And so this effort to look to the South, to look to other parts of the world, to not just exclusively trade with the North American neighbors, and such. And then I think finally, when we talk about foreign policy, of course, looking at the genocide of the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza, Mexico has taken a much, much better position on that than previous governments likely would have done or did historically. With López Obrador recognized the state of Palestine officially, opened up diplomatic relations, has pushed for a peaceful resolution of conflict, and together with Chile actually referred the case of the political leadership of the Zionist entity to the International Criminal Court. So taking a very strong position, saying that we believe what's happening here is a genocide and needs to be stopped. And so that kind of gives you an idea. Those are the major issues where there was this push by U.S. imperialism and its allies to get people on its quote-unquote side, and Mexico resisted that consistently.
So let's talk about other countries in Latin America. First, Cuba seems to be in serious trouble. In recent months, Cuba has been engulfed in its most severe energy crisis in decades, leaving its citizens enduring continuous power outages, decades of harsh U.S. sanctions have had a devastating impact, it seems, on the island's energy system. Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is of Cuban descent and seems to have a seething hatred for Cuba's communist government. José Luis, what kind of approach do you think Trump and Rubio will take toward Cuba? And what, if anything, do you think Cuba can do to defend itself from heightened hostility from the U.S. government? And in particular, is there any prospect of the Russians or the Chinese playing a role here?
Yeah, Cuba in a lot of ways symbolizes what U.S. imperialism is capable of, right? And it all kind of ties in together. We know that for much of the 21st century, Cuba was able to be buoyed by its relationship with Venezuela. But then they went after Venezuela and they destroyed its economy. Fortunately, we're seeing a bit of a recovery. We're seeing a reorganization of their economy. But still, the key resource for Venezuela is oil, and they still can't sell oil openly, freely on the international market because of the dominance of the, U.S. banking system on global movement of money, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we have to, when we think about Cuba, we have to think about U.S. imperialism in the region more generally and what it's done to Venezuela in order to harm not only the Bolivarian Revolution, but the Cuban Revolution. And we're seeing the consequence of that. And of course, one thing that we have to highlight is that this has been bipartisan, right? Obama, at the end of his term, has a very kind of soft opening of relations with Cuba. But then we saw Trump reverse that, and Biden kept it exactly the same. And I think, it is worrisome to see somebody like Marco Rubio in as the Secretary of State in the United States. I think, he seems to be mostly worried about China. I think the U.S. is correct in viewing China as an actual hegemonic rival and being threatened by that. I think they're right to be concerned about China that's every day more better connected with the world and more advanced in terms of its development. But I do think that he has, for lack of a better term, a special spot for Cuba and pushing for regime change there and seeing, and Cuba is in a weak position. López Obrador was actually awarded a medal, the highest medal that Cuba awards, because of his solidarity with Cuba and looking for the ways to support Cuba in this very difficult moment. Claudia has also maintained that. One of the things that Mexico has been doing is trying to help them with energy resources and using, for people who don't understand how the blockade of Cuba works, if a ship docks in Cuba, it can no longer dock at U.S. ports for a window of time there. So they have one ship in particular which sends oil to Cuba, so to avoid that, being sanctioned by it. Nonetheless, the U.S. finds a way. They canceled a loan for the state oil company here in Mexico, Pemex, as a result of the efforts to help Cuba in this difficult moment. So and of course, who's in power right now? It's the Democratic White House. It's likely going to get worse. It's going to get worse. It's going to get more aggressive. I think they are chomping at the bit. I think policymakers in the U.S. that have long sought for regime change feel like it might be close. Things are very difficult on the island. We should be honest about that. But of course, we also have to recognize the resilience of the Cuban people who've been putting up with this for decades. But things are very difficult right now, and that means there has to be more international solidarity. There is a very important political leader here in Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas. He was the embodiment of the Mexican Revolution, actually really tried to put it into practice and transform people's lives in the 30s when he was president. And he's a figure that is highly admired by López Obrador. When Cárdenas retired, he spent a lot of energy defending Cuba, going to Cuba, being in solidarity with the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution. I've always imagined that López Obrador could take a kind of role like that because of his affinity for Cuba and the Cuban people as well. We haven't seen that yet. He's kind of taken a back seat on that. But I do think that there needs to be more voices loudly, without equivocating, saying that what the United States is pushing in Cuba is wrong, and that other actors should step in and try to support. They have a very positive relationship with a lot of the state-owned companies in Russia. But of course, Russia has also pulled in a lot of directions, and I think they're not as able to respond and provide and fill that gap that exists in Cuba right now. And so I do think that other countries in the region can also step up and things like that. But of course, the issue here is always going to be U.S. imperialism. I just mentioned, the withdrawal of this loan for the state oil company in Mexico. They will find a way to try to cripple that. And that means that we have to be more united and more consistent on that point. I do think that a major actor like China could actually really help in terms of saying, that they have the diplomatic and economic muscle. The difficulty there is the distance, right? But I am encouraged by the fact that there have been overtures by China to Latin America in a very general way, right? Even Mexico. Much of the region, its number one trading partner is China. It's not in the case of Mexico. But even then, right, there's a deliberate push from the diplomatic corners of China for a closer relationship. And I do think that that kind of support may open the door for a stronger, better position when it comes to Cuba. I mean, universally, everybody here in the region rejects the blockade of Cuba, but of course, the end must be to actually lift it. And we're not there. And I think that needs to be a priority for governments of the region and also important allies like Russia and China.
So in July of this year, Russian warships visited Cuba and were welcomed, I believe, in Havana. And this was not the first time this had happened. Do you think that this was more of a poking the United States in the face, a symbolic gesture, or do you think it really signified a deepening of economic and political ties between Cuba and Russia?
I think the U.S. can react however it wants to, right? Go ahead. And I'm sure they were really worried and made all kinds of pronouncements when that happened. The thing is that here in Latin America, we talk a lot about sovereignty. That's the name of the podcast that I host around Mexico politics, Soberanía. Cuba is a sovereign, independent country. And if it wants to have this relationship with Russia, it can. And it's no business of the United States. It's no business of Mexico or any of the other neighbors here in the region in terms of its cooperation with Russia, if it so chooses, right? And that's the point that I really want to stress. And one of the things that worries me about Trump is that he has a total disregard for sovereignty. I don't think the Democrats are particularly in favor of defending sovereignty or to use their terminology, the rules-based international order, right? I think the genocide against the Palestinian people has proven that there's really no actual weight behind any of these positions that they claim to take. Nonetheless, but we can defend it, right? It's not a negotiable thing. This is not something where, we're going to politely ask that you respect our sovereignty. We demand that you respect our sovereignty, as we should demand that they respect the sovereignty of Cuba. That's a lot of ways what's, I think Trump is going to undermine of this, talking about invading Panama, talking about unilateral military action here in Mexico. Those things are in violation of international law. It's a violation of our sovereignty. And if that does come to happen, we need to make sure that we have a united position of that. And I was thinking ahead of this interview around that because I really do want to emphasize the fact that in a lot of ways, U.S. foreign policy, especially when it comes to Latin America, hardly changes depending on who's in the White House. One of the things that I've been trying to sound the alarm about is this talk of unilateral military action by the United States inside of Mexico. And for those of you not familiar, using the excuse of drugs and organized crime groups, quote unquote cartels, that the U.S. must do something, and has talked about drone strikes inside of Mexico without Mexican government's permission, about boots on the ground, strike teams to take out the leaders of organized crime groups and things like that. That's a total affront to our sovereignty. It cannot stand. It will not stand. It will not be allowed to happen. But ultimately, the Democrats are not too far behind, because very, very recently, there was a key figure, Mayo Zambada, El Chapo's former partner, a high-ranking member of the organized crime groups. He was kidnapped by the United States and taken to U.S. soil. That's not allowed. You can't just do that, right? They still, to this date, all right, we're almost in 2025, the U.S. government refuses to clear up what happened in that, right? There's a lot of confusion around it. Basically, he was put on a plane against his will, and he ended up somewhere in the United States. That doesn't happen without somebody in the United States government knowing it, right? The foreign minister said as much. Like there's no way that they didn't know, right? A plane can't just fly into the United States without permission to land. This was known, and yet they refused to tell us what actually happens. That's a violation of sovereignty. It's already happening with Democrats, right? And so I think in a lot of ways it's going to be more of the same, but I do think that this open disregard for sovereignty that Trump is expressing is really worrisome because it represents an escalation. But I'll end my response with this. It could also serve to unite the region. And he maybe end up playing with fire. When was Latin America most united? It was when George W. Bush was in office, when it was so obvious, when the mask of U.S. imperialism was clear to anybody to see, when you didn't have Obama kind of presenting a better managed imperialism as a public face to the populations of Latin America. And so having a figure like Trump, if he actually is serious about this, if he goes against Panama, even though Panama has a right-wing government, you will see all of Latin America unite and say, we will not tolerate this. And you may ultimately set off a domino effect that is difficult to predict of where that could end. But if I'm being optimistic, it could lead to a radicalization of the processes here, right? We could see a deepening of all of these leftist progressive governments in the region who say, we can't even operate under normal, so-called quote unquote rules anymore. Let's figure out how we get out of this situation because the US is not a reliable partner anymore. That's what Trump is threatening. And I do think it's a danger, but I do think that it potentially could also be an opportunity.
So let's talk about another potential target. I mean, almost certainly going to be a target of the Trump administration, and that's Nicaragua.
Yeah.
Interesting that you talked about the continuity of imperialistic foreign policy towards Latin America from both Democrats and Republicans, because just in May of this year, the Biden administration announced new sanctions and other restrictions on Nicaragua, apparently or ostensibly to curb migration to the U.S. southern border. Again, I think it's fair to say that Marco Rubio has a seething hatred for the left-wing government of Nicaragua. Do you think Nicaragua is in a better position to resist renewed hostility or heightened hostility from the Trump administration? How do you think they're going to deal with the incoming Trump administration? And again, do you think Russia and China, one or both, have a role to play here?
So in the case of Nicaragua, I think Nicaragua saw everything that they did to Venezuela and said, we're not going to let that happen here. You know, for example, I know that there was a lot of coverage, criticism of citizens who were thinking about running in the presidential elections being banned, right? Because they weren't candidates yet. They love using the term candidate, even though they weren't candidates. And I think, for example, that one, you know, which received a lot of scrutiny. What was the government trying to do there? They were trying to prevent another Juan Guaido, right? If the US is willing to recognize an unelected, unknown figure as the president of a country, they would do the same thing to Nicaragua. And of course, Nicaragua has a history of being, you know, facing the Contra War that was US backed and supported, funded, et cetera. So I think that Nicaragua looks at what's happening and is taking steps to prevent it from occurring to them. And I think there's really, really important moves. For example, they're very close to food sovereignty, if not actually have secured food sovereignty. That's monumental when we're talking about a country that's besieged by imperialism. Venezuela, in a lot of ways, suffered because it imported its food. Nicaragua said, we're not going to go down, we're not going to suffer that same fate, and we're going to invest in this. And yes, I think has been smart in terms of really improving its relationships with other regional or other global players. And I think that's important because, you know, they've abandoned this notion that they're ever going to be able to have any kind of negotiated agreement with the United States, right? That possibility seems close to them. And I think that they're being close to Russia with China to try to develop the productive forces inside of Nicaragua. You know, I mentioned earlier the interoceanic corridor here in Mexico. I know that they're thinking about developing something similar as well. And so I think in the case of Nicaragua as well, these threats, these are likely going to materialize because of characters like Marco Rubio. And again, that is going to require a strident defense of Nicaragua's sovereignty, and not in a selfish way, not like, oh, we defend them because it might happen to us as well, but because that this is the principle. And I think we need to reintroduce those terms into the public discourse, right? I think, again, to use their terminology, the rules-based international order turned out to be a total farce. We knew it was a farce, but they proved it for us. So I think we need to reintroduce our lexicon back into the conversation and operate on that, right? The global South is rising, right? The U.S. imperialism is declining. We are seeing the emergence of these new kinds of groups like the BRICS, which is going to see a reorganization of the global economy away from a unipolar world. Now, the Mexican government doesn't necessarily use this kind of language, but I do think that in practice, what we're seeing from Mexico is the defense of a multipolar world or a pluripolar world. And this idea that all states are equal, and it's in particular small states, and that those small states should be able to pursue its own economic political path as their population sees fit, and actually defending it on those terms, I think makes it a little bit easier, because then it's not about like, so much of the discussion happens around, well, I don't support Maduro because he's authoritarian, or, Assad was brutal and that's where he deserved what happened, right? Like, it's not about that. It's about respect for sovereignty. It's about respect for independent economic, political relationships that these countries want to pursue free of imperialism. And one final note on that, Venezuela. I'm obviously a close follower of Venezuela. There was a lot of criticism, accusations about electoral fraud. Venezuela's institutions, its sovereign institutions, the ones built by the Venezuelan people under the most adverse of circumstances, declared Maduro bueno. He's the winner. And there's no need to entertain all of these efforts to undermine the government of Venezuela, of Nicolás Maduro there. Anyway, so all that to say is that the existence of a multipolar world and the emergence of a greater power in the global south, I think, is important. And I'm glad to see that Mexico is aligned with that. In the case of Nicaragua, I would expect that it also defends Nicaragua's sovereignty.
I'm glad you mentioned the case of the Venezuelan election. I actually was there in July as an election observer. I was invited by the Venezuelan Socialist Party. And although, I can't, based on what I saw, provide a guarantee that the elections were free and fair, I saw absolutely no evidence to suggest that they weren't. The hundreds of election observers who were there with me, we were all, as far as I know, unanimous in our view that we had seen no evidence of electoral fraud. And one of the things, I want to come back to Venezuela in a moment, but I want to just elaborate on something you said. You talked about the Nicaraguan government's disqualification of certain people to run for political office. I think this needs to be said. I'm curious whether you agree that, when a government, a state as powerful as the United States, backed by other lesser states, but nonetheless very influential states, like, for example, Britain, France, and so forth, decides that they want to dislodge a popular government, a left-leaning popular government, or it might not be left-leaning, it just might be a government that's determined to pursue an independent path and exercise real sovereignty. When they decide that they're going to take out that government by any and all means available to them, whether it might be, a violent coup or crushing economic sanctions or disinformation campaigns, they're basically forcing the government, for purposes of its own survival, to adopt what might be regarded as authoritarian or anti-democratic measures as a protective strategy against the interference in their sovereignty. So, in my view, and this is what I'm curious to have your view on this, José Luis, we, to a large degree, and when I say we, I'm talking about Western governments, we are putting these governments, those of, for example, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, in a position oftentimes where they have to be much more, quote unquote, authoritarian than they might otherwise be inclined to be, simply to protect their own sovereignty. What's your view about all that?
Yeah, I mean, you opened that question talking about the Venezuelan election, and they love to say in the bourgeois media, mainstream media, oh, it wasn't free and fair. How can it possibly be free and fair when you have U.S. imperialism bearing down on you, when you have unilateral coercive measures aimed at securing regime change in Venezuela, where you can't sell your number one commodity freely in the international market? That's what's not free and fair, right? And it's interesting that Maduro gets tagged as an authoritarian for repressing protests that are very violent, that involve killing, burning people alive, right? Like, we have to understand the history of the far right in Venezuela. They pay young people to engage in horribly violent acts, to put up these road blockades, to try to hang wire across the road to decapitate people on motorcycles, right? Oh, but Maduro, who uses the legitimate armed forces of the state, the security forces, to stop this, he's the authoritarian. No, the authoritarians are the imperialists, are the people who, like you said, force these circumstances upon countries. It is not illegitimate to protect your sovereignty, to protect your institutions, to defend the actual political process that is happening in your country, which enjoys widespread support. And I'm really harsh on this one because in the case of Mexico, that's the language they've been using. It's the same exact language when López Obrador was elected in a landslide victory, using all of the institutions that the neoliberal order offered to him, right? Bourgeois elections, bourgeois political parties, and actually the history of the parliamentary left in Mexico also involved political assassinations, the buying of important leaders, and the destruction of its electoral political parties, which it's too long of a history to get into here. But the point is that he played by the rules. He played by their rules and won, and has transformed the country under his leadership, and as that has continued with Claudia Sheinbaum. And nonetheless, despite by playing all the rules, winning all the elections, much like Chavez did when he was president in Venezuela, is tagged as an authoritarian. Although there's really no basis to it, right? But that doesn't mean that if a state actually finds itself in the situation of having to face down, again, to go back to the case of Venezuela, mercenary invasions, right? The soft tools, the soft diplomacy tools, the funding of opposition organizations inside of your country, through quote unquote NGOs, things like that, then of course you should use the levers of the state that are available to you to defend the popular will, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, Maduro has been re-elected. And this is a long history of people backing the Bolivarian Revolution. And therefore, if there are efforts to unconstitutionally change that, then of course they have the right to protect the Constitution, right? And so this labeling of authoritarianism, I think, is just, it's unfortunate to see people who call themselves the left to fall into it, because I think you're playing U.S. intelligence agencies' game, right? That they're the ones who most promote this kind of language in order to delegitimize what is actually a thoroughly democratic and peaceful. Chavez used to always say, our revolution is peaceful but not unarmed. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, the people demand a different kind of political order in their countries, right? In the case of Mexico, that expressed itself through the election of López Obrador and the election of Claudia Sheinbaum. That deserves to be respected. Those states should pursue what they need. The supermajority here in Mexico, I'll finish with this, it is extraordinary, right? Morena and its allies can pretty much do whatever it wants, right? They could declare Mexico a socialist country and put it in the constitution if they wanted to. And that is often declared to be authoritarian. Oh, they're not Democrats anymore. They're not negotiating with the opposition, et cetera, et cetera. This kind of language. What it actually is the fulfillment of the aspirations of the Mexican population, who was sick of the neoliberal order, who was tired of living in a wealthy country but having so much inequality and poverty, and saying, we're going to use what's available to us to change it, and actually doing it. And as we can see most recently in the election here in Mexico, that when you do that, the people embrace you even further and give you an even stronger mandate, right? And therefore, I think there is no room to question the mandate and the right to protect this political project that is happening in the case of Mexico, case of Venezuela, case of Nicaragua, case of Cuba.
Next, I want to ask you about the question of migration. And before I ask you my question, José Luis, I want to talk about my own personal experience and view about this. And it's just as a context for my question, and that is that my parents came to Canada from Greece in the 1950s. They came in the aftermath not only of the brutal Nazi occupation of Greece, but also a civil war, which followed the expulsion of the Nazis from Greece. And that civil war was actually provoked by the British because they were very concerned that the Greek communists, who had done more to resist the Nazi occupation than anybody, was going to come to power. So they basically organized a civil war where the communists were opposed by Nazi collaborators and monarchists and right-leaning Republicans. And the country was utterly devastated by the time my parents were in their mid-teens. The Canadian government was looking for cheap labor from Southern Europe. They weren't interested in bringing people from the global South. They went to the second-class citizens of Europe. brought them over in large ships. My parents took the offer, but my parents told me from the time that I was born in Canada, and they inculcated this in my mind and the minds of my sisters, is that we were Greeks first, Canadians second, and that they had come to Canada out of economic necessity, and it broke their hearts to leave their country. It's always been my view that is the general, economic migrants generally feel that way. Of course, there are exceptions, but it's not that they want to leave the place that has always been home to them, the place whose culture they understand and share, the language that they speak, and so forth. They leave because they are in desperate economic straits. And the idiocy, the ultimate stupidity of Western foreign policy, and particularly U.S. foreign policy, is that we create these economically desperate situations in countries that are simply they don't pose any threat whatsoever to the West. They're simply trying to exercise their own right of sovereignty. And then when these desperate people come to our borders, we treat them like animals. We treat them worse than animals. And it seems to me that Trump is going to double down on this utterly insane policy of pursuing economically devastating sanctions programs against countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and so forth. And this is going to spur even more desperate outflows of peoples from these countries to the southern border of the United States. And he'll react to that by being even more draconian and more brutal in terms of suppressing migration in the United States. Is it your experience as someone from the region that people are leaving their countries in large numbers, not because they want to, not because they have some secret longing to be Americans and to be raised as Americans, but simply because they have no better prospect and they're willing to take the risks of migration, as great as they may be, because staying at home appears to them to be an even worse prospect?
So a number of years ago, I wrote an article and I ended up titling it based on a quote from one of the migrants who told me, "We're not migrating, we're fleeing." And I think people need to understand it that way. And I think if you look at, let's just keep it to the most recent migratory flows. For a while there, they mostly came from Central America, from places like Honduras. In fact, in 2018, Honduras was the number one source country of migrants headed to the United States. Why? Because there was a brutal right-wing narco dictatorship there backed by the United States of Juan Orlando Hernandez. And that made it impossible for people to have even a dignified life, in Honduras. And so they were forced to flee. More recently, where have they come from? Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti. And what do they have in common? They're countries that have been suffering under the boot of US imperialism. And so it's not particularly surprising that there are consequences to this. I think the very subtle easing of sanctions that happened under the Biden administration towards Venezuela were in part driven by the fact that they recognize that destroying Venezuela's economy is one of the major reasons why we're seeing the outflow of so many people from that country. And I think you are absolutely right when you say that by pursuing some of these policies, it's only going to make the situation far worse. If you really turn the screws on Venezuela, if you really turn the screws on Cuba and Nicaragua, you're going to see more migrants. If you implement 25% tariffs against Mexico, you're going to see more migrants from Mexico, right? This is the consequence of the sort of the echo effect, the ripple effect of US foreign policy in the region, which is why I think we should center the migration question always around that, about resisting US imperialism. The United States talks a lot about attending to the root causes, and then we'll go around and announce private investment for maquiladoras in Central America, right? That's not going to change things. It may keep a handful of people who find direct employment from migrating, maybe, if the money actually flows. But that's not the solution. You want to talk about the root causes? I invite people to look at something that's called the Palenque Declaration. So López Obrador calls for a meeting of heads of state of countries with a high migrant population flow. So Venezuela, Cuba, Honduras was there, and I forget the rest, but there are a number of heads of state there. And they gather, and that declaration, if you contrast it, for example, with the Los Angeles Declaration, which is also related to migration, which happened as a result of the Summit of the Americas, which Mexico boycotted, by the way, because of the exclusion of certain countries, it's very, very different. When they talk about root causes, they talk about sanctions. They talk about policies they're called draw policies, like the wet foot, dry foot, which doesn't exist anymore, but that actually entices people to leave, Or, for example, there was, during a certain period, an effort to actually invite more flows out of Venezuela as part of their political strategy to undermine the Bolivarian revolution and to pursue regime change in Venezuela. We had Sebastián Piñera saying, come to Chile, right? And now you have Gabriel Boric saying, no, we don't have room for you. This is a major problem for us, right? There was this effort to actually drive migration as due to political considerations, right? So what is the common denominator here? It's U.S. imperialism. Now, in the case of Mexico, I do want to be critical, and I do think that Mexico has been far too accommodating of U.S. policy when it comes to migration. To give you a very kind of crude analysis, it was a trade-off. So when Trump comes in, and again, when he starts threatening all of these actions, we're talking about Trump's first term, Mexico basically said, all right, we'll cooperate, we'll abandon our strategy that we wanted to implement when it comes to migration, and we will enforce a harder regime here to prevent the flows of migrants. And that has largely stayed true throughout of his term and into Claudia Sheinbaum's term. I do think that Mexico could take a stronger position and refuse to it, but ultimately, I disagree with those who actually go so far as to say that if Mexico said no, then the U.S. wouldn't be able to do any of this. That puts all of the onus on Mexico, which I think is unfair because Mexico is involved in this because of its proximity, because it has a border with the United States. It's not necessarily our policies that are actually driving this migration flows that people are seeking to go into the United States. It's actually putting all of the responsibility on the geopolitical actor who is weaker in terms of the strategy. The push has to be on the U.S. They're the ones who have to change their policy. The focus has to be on ending imperialism. There needs to be better collaboration between migrants' rights activists and anti-imperialist activists who understand that there's a push behind these migrants that is stemming from U.S. intervention in the region. And I do think that if we don't get smart about it, like you said, the scenario that you are describing is very likely to happen, right? So we'll see even greater flows of migration, of people seeking. There'll be more pressure on Mexico to crack down and to keep them from ever reaching the U.S. southern border. And even if they do, we're going to see the emergence of, migrant camps or, again, violations of sovereignty, where they'll just push the migrants into Mexico without actually an agreement from the country. These are nightmare scenarios that I think are very possible if we're not smart in terms of looking at what are the real root causes and actually attending to those and getting that to change. You want to see less Venezuelans arrive at the U.S. southern border and unilateral coercive measures immediately. No negotiation, right? There's nothing else to talk about when it comes to that. End it. It is an abuse of the U.S.'s power over the financial system that shouldn't be allowed to stand, right? If, we have to say no to these tariffs, which will destroy the economies and lead to more of this. And I think to tie it in with the very beginning of your commentary, I too am a migrant. I was born here in Mexico, but I grew up in the United States and Canada. I'm very sympathetic to the experience of migrants. I've had to, resettle in new countries on more than 3 occasions, and it's a very difficult process. I do think that what Mexico could do and hasn't been doing is better guaranteeing the human rights of migrants when they're inside of Mexico. So we can't do anything about people wanting to reach the United States. We can't really do too much other than resist U.S. positions when it comes to Latin America, but we can treat them way better while they're here. Migrants will consistently tell you the most difficult part of the journey, aside from the Darien Gap, which is physically dangerous, is Mexico because of the long journey, the barriers, the extortion that they suffer from organized crime groups and from security officials. All of that, I think, can be better attended. And I do think that is the responsibility of Mexico. And I would like to see the Mexican government do a better job when it comes to that. But really, I want to insist on this. This will never be solved as long as the U.S. continues to pursue regime change in places like Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. And that is what actually needs to stop if we want to be serious about the migration phenomenon.
Here, 100%. Last thing I want to ask you about, José Luis, is a major infrastructure project which caught my eye and maybe a sign of what lies ahead, and that is in Peru. The Chinese have built, it's actually their state-owned shipping company, Costco, has built a $3.5 billion megaport in a coastal town. I believe it's Shanxi, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was a sleepy fishing village apparently, and now is about to become a major logistical powerhouse. Peru, I always understood, certainly in the recent past, that it had a government that was could fairly be described as right-leaning, not one that you would think would be, anxious to develop deep economic ties with the communist government of the People's Republic of China. This seems like a frontal assault on the Monroe Doctrine by the Chinese. What do you think is going on there? I mean, is my assessment of the Peruvian government correct, that it is not in any way, shape, or form a left-leaning government, that it has tended to be quite obedient, in terms of U.S. foreign policy? And if so, what kind of a statement does this make about where the future of Latin American nations lie, that they're willing to do very extensive business with China, notwithstanding the imposition of the Monroe Doctrine?
The case of Peru, you're right. It is a right-wing dictatorship there, I would say, because, we saw the election of Pedro Castillo, a progressive. He defeated the fascist Keiko Fujimori, daughter of the former dictator, but he was ousted in a coup. He had a lot of difficulty governing. They made it virtually impossible for him to govern. And I think we should probably mention that I think a lot of it has to do with that the Lima ruling class hated that a campesino from the countryside of Peru became president. And they seemed to never tolerate his authority, and ultimately it culminated in a coup. And his vice president made a dramatic shift to the right, decided to align herself with, Dina Boluarte is her name, with the reactionaries of her country and with U.S. imperialism. But this is an interesting case. Even people like Javier Milei has found himself negotiating with the Chinese. Why? Well, because countries will pursue their self-interests, and cozying up to the United States doesn't really pay off anymore, right? That used to be the trade-off. Align yourself with the U.S., mirror our positions everywhere, become a client state, if you will. But you'll have an economic relationship. You'll benefit from it. At least the domestic elites will benefit from it, right? You'll see that the comprador bourgeoisie enrich itself, and some of that will maybe trickle down to the population, right? But that's no longer the case. It's not really even an attractive offer for most leaderships of most countries anymore, right? There's a reason why over the last 20 years, most of the countries of Latin America, with the exception of, if I'm not mistaken, Paraguay and Mexico, the number one trading partner now is China, because it's a better relationship. It's a more beneficial relationship. It is not conditioned the way that the U.S. one is. And obviously, I think, I'm not a China expert, but what I've been able to observe is a foreign policy that is driven by mutual benefit. So, China builds a port here, but they'll be able to access, the market in South America better. That seems to make a whole lot more sense as opposed to what has been traditionally relationship with the United States. And that story in particular of Peru, I think, is the perfect highlight, because right around the same time, surely you know this, Blinken goes down there to announce with a lot of fanfare their own offer to the Peruvian government. And it was a bunch of old trains from California, old rusty trains to so-called build a transit infrastructure project there. I mean, what a perfect illustration of why countries are becoming closer with China. Again, I can't view that as nothing but a positive thing. A multipolar world is better, because if we can actually lessen the influence, the dominance of even the dominance of the US dollar, it means that they have less tools to be able to coerce countries. Imagine if Venezuela could sell oil not using US dollars anymore, without having to go to intermediaries, because there is an alternative currency that has global acceptance in the rest of it, right? So right-wing governments, Javier Milei, Dina Boluarte, they're cozying up to China too, because it makes more sense, right? That it is a beneficial thing for these countries, and it's not even that hard of a sell, I think. And the U.S., I think, is realizing that its ability to influence, to interfere in the region is waning, and I think that makes them very nervous, and that, I think, is dangerous, right? Because they might go really far with this, right? Like, who knows the lengths they'll go to with it. Is Trump serious about an invasion of Panama? I think not, but it's not impossible. The U.S. invaded Grenada. It invaded Panama previously, right? This is not something that's relatively recent. They backed the coup against Evo Morales. They backed the coup against Dilma Rousseff, right? Read mainstream media coverage of the car wash scandal in Brazil, and it's obviously all aligned to oust the PT from there. They are very much willing to go to very extreme lengths. Part of this interview, I talked about the case of Mexico. I am worried about unilateral U.S. action inside of Mexico, but it's already happening. They're already doing it. So none of this should surprise us. In fact, we should be prepared, because I do think that when you push somebody into a corner, they become more dangerous. And I do think that the U.S. is very much approaching that circumstance, and it's going to be already unpredictable with a president who is notoriously unpredictable.
Yeah. And I think, Jose Luis, that he's likely to feel very emboldened because to be fair to Trump, he had to confront ferocious attempts by, the neocons in Washington and the Biden administration to prevent him from running at all. Yeah. He overcame them. He was almost killed during the campaign. He secured a majority in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. So I think, if anything, we are likely to see an even more aggressive, even more assertive Trump administration this time than we did the first time around. And I'm sure we're going to have very interesting things to talk about in the months ahead in terms of Latin America's relationship with the United States. And I hope we can have you back on and continue the conversation, Jose Luis.
Absolutely. Really, really glad to have had this conversation. If I have to close on anything, you're right. I totally agree. And that means that we have to be bold in our resistance too. We have to be creative. The old ways may not be sufficient anymore. You're right. I think he's going to become emboldened, and that's all the more important why we actually not only get better organized, but also present more of a united front of actually building anti-imperialist organizations and capacity to say no to this, because otherwise the future of humanity might be at stake.
And that's why we call this program Reason to Resist. Thank you very much, Jose Luis. We'll talk again in the future.
Anytime.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal on the final day of 2024.